sorry. So all the people who are on the live stream, thank you very much for following. We're glad to have y'all. All the people here in the building, thank you so much for sticking out and hanging out with us all day. It's really, really, really great to see so many people interested in mycology and willing to support this this kind of local movement here in Atlanta and in the greater Southeast. We do take all of this content that we're generating, we live stream it, and we've been cutting it up into YouTube videos. So if you go to YouTube and you type in Atlanta Mushroom Festival, you will see content from when we first started doing education. It was like our second festival. And of course, you know, we did the best we could. You can slowly see over time the production value getting a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. You know, we're doing the best we can with what we got. And you know, really we're only as good as the people that support us. And we are so glad to have y'all here and to continue supporting this event. This was something that Dave and we went to Georgia Mushroom Festival back in 2021. I think it was in March. And we realized that most of the people there were actually from Atlanta. And we were like, okay, you know, this is cool. Great going to Cave Spring. But if all of these folks are from Atlanta, why aren't we doing this in Atlanta? And so that kind of created the whole idea to do this Atlanta Mushroom Festival. And originally it started out as a market. It started out as like just a bunch of vendors, and Dave has connections to music through his old job working at BMI. And that's kind of where it all started. So he got some of his friends to get up on stage, and you know, Claudia was very generous and shared some of her vendors with us, and we reached out to them and they were willing to come out. And that was kind of the beginning of this whole thing. So, you know, truly what keeps it running is really good relationships with these vendors, developing new relationships with speakers, and obviously the continued support of all of you who keep coming back again and again and again to really make this event great, because it wouldn't be anything without y'all. So thank you again very much. Just wanted to throw that out there to all of you who've been participating and keep showing up and keep making the magic happen for us, because that's the reason why we just keep pushing through and keep doing it. So with that, my name is Paul Grzybowski. I'm one of your hosts, Dave, here in the Atlanta Mushroom Festival t-shirt. Take pictures. He is your other host. And yeah, we do a whole bunch of different things. I went and got a degree in chemistry at Georgia Tech, minor in material science engineering. I did that whole thing. And then I got a job at CDC working in the Division of Tuberculosis Elimination Applied Research Team. I was doing this oligotyping assay, which is a way of doing molecular epidemiology. So epidemiology is tracking a disease. Molecular being we were looking at the genome of these diseases, specifically this direct repeat loci within the TB genome. And that's how we were able to track who was kind of giving what to who as we would get, you know, roughly 10,000 isolates a year from around the United States. And that's how we were kind of keeping track of things. But after that, you know, they offered me a full-time position. I was like, no thanks, and decided to go and full-time into mushrooms. And I haven't looked back since. Like the mushrooms, I'm with Chad. I truly believe they're going to save this planet. I know that they already are saving this planet, and all we got to do is just get the heck out of the way. So, you know, before we started screwing things up, they were making the magic happen way, way, way before we were ever getting in their way. And that's kind of a lot of what I'm about to go and talk about. This is a talk on the history of psychedelic mushrooms and their cultivation, kind of to give some of a little bit of focus, but also more of like a broad scope view of human history with psychedelic mushrooms and how we got to the point where you can now in 47 states have legal access to spores from psilocybin cubensis and other psychedelic species, and also buy mushroom grow kits pretty much anywhere, because grow kits don't contain any active spores or mycelia. And so that's kind of all of that there's just this ginormous journey that occurred in order to get to this point, and that's kind of what I'm going to be discussing in this presentation. So first, we got to talk about our ancient fascination with mushrooms. Like, where did it all really begin? And so the oldest cave paintings that we have are found in Tassil and Algeria. circa 7,000 to 5,000 BC. You can see these shaman-like figures, and they are holding mushrooms in their hands. They also are covered in mushrooms, and they're radiating this kind of fractal-ish energy. This image was actually published by Terence McKenna in 1992 in the Food for the Gods, A Search for the Original Tree of Knowledge. And so to me, it's very clear that they were consuming mushrooms. And not only were they consuming them because it's in their hands, but they are like becoming the mushroom. They are becoming this thing. And so this is almost 9,000 years old, right? So there's already a long history. Next, we traveled to Selva Pascuala, Spain, circa 6,000 to 4,000 BC. And in 1918, these archaeologists discovered these other really amazing cave paintings where it's kind of hard to see with the light, but there's a bull in this top left corner. And then over here, you have these mushroom-like images, these figures. And so, interestingly, Psilocybia hispanica grows in the region that they found these cave paintings. And the people at the time were nomadic herders. And so it's very interesting. They often would paint depictions of the things that they herded, particularly these bulls. And these bulls no longer exist. They're an extinct species. And of course, we all know that where there's bovine, where there's bulls and cattle, those types of things, you tend to find psychedelic mushrooms that grow out of their poop. And so it's really not a terribly far reach to kind of just look at this depiction and be like, well, they were following the animals. So how likely would it have been that this psychedelic species that has existed for thousands and thousands and thousands of years could have very well been possibly growing out of the poop and was so relevant that they needed to go and put it on a wall that was going to last, in their minds, forever. The next earliest case is in Mesoamerica, so Central and South America, from anywhere between 3,000 and 1,000 BC. You have Incans, the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the pre-Columbians that were all creating these mushroom figures. And you notice that these are not necessarily figures of humans with the mushrooms, but you see another instance where the mushroom is within, like the human is within the mushroom. Kind of like the shaman, the mushrooms were on the outside, the human was inside of it. Here you see another instance of that, where you have the human inside of this mushroom form, right? So as much as it's being consumed, they are almost becoming it. By consuming it, they are becoming this mushroom. And I just think that that's really interesting. And it just shows that this is something that's been happening for a very, very, very long time. One last case of petroglyphs. Soviet geologists discovered these in 1967 in Siberia, Russia, around 1 CE. And these were made by nomadic whale hunters. And they were dubbed the fly agaric people. And there is very common knowledge that within the native cultures there, that fly agarics were the mushrooms that they were consuming. Probably also with certain types of cubensis, but the agarics are very cold tolerant and probably the most likely culprits and are well known to grow in that region. And so those are the ancient depictions of mushrooms. And so, you know, from 1 CE, there's been nothing that's been really discovered all the way up until you have when the Spanish started invading the Americas. And so now they started documenting in these codexes the history of the Aztec culture and their use with mushrooms. And so no one really has said anything yet. They're just depictions, they're drawings of the things that they would see as they were touring these ruins in these cities. And so you have the Mixtec American Codex, which was written in 500 AD, and the Codex Magdalia Becciano, which is written or named by Antonio Magdaleno Becci, who published this, who was a friar that was trying to basically collect information about the culture. And in both of these depictions, you have gods that are consuming the mushrooms, it's in their hands, and humans that are being touched by the gods when they consume these mushrooms. So they saw these mushrooms as a way to, as a portal, in order to have access to these higher powers, these higher beings. And as I go further into this presentation, that essence is preserved almost all the way into modern times. So the first person to actually write down the use of these psychedelics, not just showing a picture, but to really spell out what they were doing and how these people were using them, was Bernardino de Sahagún. And he wrote the Florentine Codex, which is a manuscript of 2,500 pages combined into 12 books with 2,000 illustrations drawn by native artists. So he wanted to use native artists to draw all of these different depictions to really capture the essence of their culture. And it's very interesting because he did this for three main reasons. He wanted to describe their ancient religious beliefs and practices so that other friars could understand how to evangelicalize the natives, to convert them. He wanted to create a vocabulary for the Aztec language in order to provide cultural context to that language. And he wanted to record and document the great cultural inheritance of the indigenous people of New Spain in order to help with its colonization. So that was a lot of the preface of why these early works were documenting all of this, so they could better understand kind of who the people were, how they received information, and how to then change their minds into believing the new world order that was brought from Spain. And so there was pretty much radio silence all the way up from 1500s until the Wassons. Robert Gordon Wasson and his wife Valentina Pavlovna Wasson. And it's actually pretty interesting. So his wife was a pediatrician. Valentina was a pediatrician, and he worked for Guarantee Trust Company. He was a banker. And then he ended up moving over to JP Morgan and Company and was able to attain the esteemed position of public relations, as head of public relations, after writing a book exonerating JP Morgan of guilt in the Hall Carbide incident of 1961. The Hall Carbide incident was a very unique case where JP Morgan was providing money to someone who was war profiteering. And so, you know, Gordon Wasson was a sympathizer for the rich. And where his interest began, where they kind of began combining their knowledge at this intersection, because he, coming from an Anglo-Saxon background, was afraid of mushrooms. He wanted nothing to do with them. He did not like them. He had no interest in them. And his wife, being Russian, and right, we just talked about the fly agaric people in Siberia, their whole culture, they're very pro fungi. And so they got married in 1962, and it was during their honeymoon in the Catskill Mountains in 1927, they got married in 1926, and it wasn't until their honeymoon a year later in the Catskill Mountains that his wife was going around and she was foraging mushrooms. And he's like, what the heck are you doing? Like, don't do that. And she's like, no, they're fine. And so she actually prepared a meal with these mushrooms. And from that moment forward, they sat down and had a conversation, and they were able to talk about his mycophobia and the way that and her mycophilia, she loved, her love of mushrooms, and were able to come to an understanding that maybe there's a lot more to learn here. And interestingly enough, it wasn't until much later that he ended up getting connected to psychedelic mushrooms in a very interesting way, and I'll go over that shortly. So the next big player here is Maria Sabina Magdalena Garcia. She was born July 22nd, 1894, and she lived to be 91 years old. She was a Mazatec Sabia. Sabia is a wise woman. There's Curiandos, who are kind of people of magic. She was not that. She was a Sabia. There's a difference. And she lived in Hualata de Jimenez, which is a tiny town in the Sierra Mazatec area of Oaxaca, Mexico. And she held veladas. Veladas were healing ceremonies. These healing ceremonies mostly used psilocybin cerulerescens, and in some cases psilocybin mexicana, kind of whatever was in season. And so there was knowledge of having multiple species that were available at the time. And she came from a long lineage of shamans. Her grandfather and her great-grandfather were all shamans. And so she decided that she wanted to follow this path. And veladas were seen as a way of purification and communion with the sacred. So the Mazatec traditions that were from, that were in the early 1500s, that still carried all the way through into modern history. And these veladas were often performed to help find lost objects, to heal people with illnesses that normal medicines wouldn't fix, and to gain insight into life decisions. You're at a crossroads, very big decision needs to be made. What do I do? And so the people would come to her, and she would hold ceremony for them. And so now, kind of tying it all together, how it all played out. In 1952, the poet Robert Graves sent Wasson a letter, because they were friends. And in this letter contained a journal from Richard Evans Schultz, who's thought to be the father of modern ethnobotany. And this publication that was published in 1938 discussed the ancient rituals of various intoxicants of Mesoamerica. It was basically on all the codices that were written by these friars, the first Spanish that came over. And after seeing this, he thought this was incredibly interesting. And so he started searching around Mexico to see if he could find these magic mushrooms. And he ended up running into Maria Sabina, which there's a picture of the two of them together. And for many years, for 2 years, she would not hold a velada with him because she didn't trust him, because he was an outsider to their culture. And so what he did is in 1956, told her, "Oh, my son, he's lost. I cannot find him. My wife is worried sick." And so his wife Valentina, and Alan Richards, who's the photographer, that is a good friend of his that's a photographer, they all went down to visit Maria Sabina. He explained to her that his son was lost, and under these conditions, she was willing to hold this velada for him. And they asked, "Can we take photos?" And she said, "Yes, you can take photos, but please don't show anybody. This is for you. These are photos that you get to see, but I don't want the world seeing this." And so she held this velada, and it completely expanded his mind. And that's when he realized the full potential of psychedelic mushrooms. And interestingly, Maria Sabina is quoted as saying, "Before Wasson, nobody took the children simply to find God. They were always taken to cure the sick." And so you could see the cultural shift that happened once someone who didn't really understand what the sacredness of what was being held and what it was for got their hands on it and where it ended up taking them. And sadly, Maria Sabina, because of this, ended up having her house burned down. Her son was murdered. And she went to prison multiple times because the local authorities thought she was selling drugs to people. And it ended up ruining her life in the long run. And so she made the sacrifice for all of us to be here at this point in order to imbibe ourselves with this sacred knowledge. Because it is a knowledge to know that these things are edible and that they do what they do. And so, thank you, Maria Sabina. And so what's interesting is that MK Ultra, right, now the government's getting involved. And so there's this project called Project Artichoke that after the Second World War, all the Nazi German scientists who were performing all sorts of horrible experiments on their subjects in the concentration camps, they got immunity to come over to the United States and start working for us. And that gave birth to Project Artichoke. And so Project Artichoke was using all sorts of intoxicants, mescaline, morphine, pretty much anything we could get our hands on, to see if we could use it as a way to mind control people and to create sleeper cells, right? To get people to do what we wanted them to do. And Project Artichoke was started in August 20th, 1951, and it was succeeded by Project MK which got a lot more funding. And so MK in 1956, after he had had his velada with Maria Sabina, he actually went back and was like, okay, he had gotten $2,000 of funding from the government. Allegedly, he did not know that this was coming directly from the CIA, but they were very interested in knowing, the CIA was very interested in knowing what these mushrooms were and getting access to them and knowing more about what Maria Sabina was doing. And so that's what he did. And he went and collected these mushrooms, and he ended up sending them off to Dr. Heim, who went and further was able to cultivate them. And I get into all that in a couple more slides. And thanks to John Marks for bringing all of this to light, who through the Freedom of Information Act in 1976 was able to extract this information and show us more about how the government's been trying to seed us with all of this, with their ideology of information. And so shortly after that, so we had 1956. So in 1957, May 13th, Life magazine published Wasson's experience, Seeking the Magic Mushroom. He originally wanted to call it Seeking the Sacred Mushroom, but Life magazine was like, magic mushroom, much more catchy, better branding, we make more money. So that's what they went with. And that's how magic mushrooms, as the colloquial term, came into being because of that article. And they ended up promoting images of Maria Sabina without her consent. And, but they did not reveal her name or her location. They just put the pictures of her with Gordon together. And then 5 days later, on May 18th, Wasson, Valentina, and Robert both co-published Russia, Mushrooms, and History. And in this book, they did put Maria Sabina's name, her location, and how to find her. And this is what led to her downfall. Because now with this book, everybody had access, and so all the hippies thought that the only place they could find this mystical experience was in Oaxaca, Mexico, and that there was only one person that could offer it. And so they were raiding the city in droves, and that's what ended up creating all of the dissonance within her community, and what ended up putting her on the path to ruin. And so, going a little bit forward into the future, so 1957 is when Roger Heim got his hands on these species that MK went and funded for Gordon Wasson to go and collect. And so Roger Heim is a French botanist. He specialized in mycology. He's published over 560 articles with a focus on mushroom anatomy, phylogeny, but also produced many major works in the field of botany, chemistry, forestry, a whole bunch of different stuff. And he was able to take the mushroom samples and grow Psilocybin mexicana. And now with this mushroom in hand, and you can see the mexicana here, unlike cubensis, mexicana grows very, very thin stems, very small caps. And it also is a sclerotia-producing species. Produces little philosopher's stones, much like Tempenensis. And he then took these mushrooms and sent it to Albert Hofmann, which I'm sure everybody here knows. Albert Hofmann's very famous for synthesizing LSD in 1938 and then forgetting about it and then rediscovering it and defining its activity April 16th in 1943 with the whole, and then accidentally dosing himself 3 days later on April 19th, aka Bicycle Day. And so in 1958, he was the first person to go and extract psilocybin and to define it as the active drug. And about 5 years later, he also produced a patent for the synthesis of psilocybin. And he later then took the active drug, made it into capsules, and took it back to Maria Sabina and gave it to her. And Ali was talking about this earlier in the talk, in his talk with Emory. And she too found that the psilocybin still had the spirit of the molecule within it, and she deemed just as active as the mushrooms themselves. And so there's a whole bunch of publications that rapid fire from 1957 all the way into 1966. And it's all been the scientific community. So we have something that still hasn't actually reached the public yet. We have this publication in Life. Oh, there's this thing. It does stuff. It's really cool. It'll change your whole perspective on everything. But no one has access to it unless you're going down and pestering Maria Sabina in Oaxaca, Mexico, right? So how do we get to the point where you can go on the internet, go onto YouTube, and just Google it, right? And so all these scientists, Heim, Singer, Ames, Kneebone, just to name a few, put in a ton of research into identifying different ways of culturing these species and growing these species, finding out the media they like, finding out the different ways that they produce. And all of this information was then condensed by Robert E. Brown into the first mass publication, which is the Psychedelic Guide to the Preparation of the Eucharist in a few of its many guises. And it described methods of growing hallucinogenic fungi on auger, liquid culture, uncased grain, and compost, which were all the things that these scientists had put a whole bunch of work and research into. And he took that information, was able to condense it into a very simple roadmap so that other people could start growing mushrooms. This is the first book or pamphlet that was published that talked about cultivation. But because this was such a small community of people, it still hadn't really gained a lot of traction. And even if you knew how to grow it, how do you get your hands on a sample, right? This is way before the shroomery or whoever else was selling spores, or you had access to a giant forum of people that could go and like send you a print or whatever, right? So great, now I know how to grow it. Where the heck do I find it? And so it wasn't but 2 years later that Leonard Enos produced A Key to the American Psilocybin Mushroom, which was the first of many pamphlets that he produced over the next 10 years, talking about how the heck to go and find these types of mushrooms growing here in North America. And so it wasn't until 1970 that we were like, okay, we don't have to go to Mexico anymore. We can find them in our backyard. And then James P. San Antonio modernized the cultivation methods. People were mostly growing on uncased media. And it was James P. San Antonio with Agaricus bisporus, where he started taking colonized grain of Agaricus, which are button mushrooms, and then adding a casing to it and showing that he was able to significantly increase his yields that way. And so now we're one step closer to a modern cultivation technique. And then, of course, you have Terence and Dennis McKenna, who at the time went under the guise of O.T. Oss and O.N. Orick, who produced the Psilocybin Magic Mushroom Growers Guide in 1976. And this was the blockbuster book that at the time, for a lack of better terms, broke the internet. So after they produced this book, obviously the internet wasn't around then, or it wasn't in the public's hands at that point. But at that time, you now have a easy to follow guide, you have modern cultivation techniques, and you have an identification guide. Now you've got all the tools. So with these pamphlets in hand, you could go into your backyard or go into your local cow field, identify something, and then with Terence McKenna's book, you can say, okay, now I know how to do auger preparation, I know how to make slants, I know how to make compost, I know how to sterilize. And that was kind of the birth of the movement as a whole into the way that we now see it and receive it. There were several other people and other books that came out that were giant stepping stones along the way. You got Stephen Pollack. He mostly spent a lot of his time researching mushrooms that produce sclerotia, the philosopher's stones, your Tempenensis, your Mexicanas. And he produced his book, Magic Mushroom Cultivation, which described many cold weather psilocybin species native to the Pacific Northwest. And he described techniques for pasteurizing straw for Copelandia and Panoleus, which are unlike cubensis, a little bit more difficult to cultivate. So now he broadened the scope of what was, what you could cultivate, and produced a ton of methods for producing sclerotia from Tempenensis and Mexicana. Next, in 1977, you also have Jules Stevens and Rich Gee, who produced How to Identify and Grow Psilocybin Mushrooms, which provided a whole bunch more identification methods. And that was the first book to suggest growing auger slants. So now you have auger slants, and that got introduced in 1977. And then later, the following year, you have Paul Stamets with his Psilocybin Mushrooms and Their Allies, which was a field guide to psychedelic mushrooms, psychoactive mushrooms in the Pacific Northwest, and identified several species that were native to Mexico, and also featured an 11-page tech for cultivating at home. So now it wasn't just, because all of these other documents didn't necessarily have pictures, it was just a bunch of words. And so Paul Stamets was able to go and bring, put a whole bunch of pictures together and make it more understandable. And so in 1978, Jeremy Bigwood produced his book, Hallucinogenic Mushrooms of North America. This was the first to illustrate step-by-step cultivation in full color. So everything was in black and white up until this book. And it was also translated into Spanish, making it the first a European book on identifying psilocybin mushrooms. So this is how Europe was able to start identifying psychedelic mushrooms that were local to their area. And he was the first person to suggest using syringes for inoculating cultures as a part of improving sterile technique. So up until that point, it was all open air. And then Rich Gee produced his book, Cubensis Aquarium Gardening, in 1955. So there's a big leap from Jeremy Bigwood to Rich Gee, where there was a lot of other pamphlets and other information, but no large technological leaps. Because at this point, we've got auger, we've got slants, we've got casing, we've got cultivating with grain, we've got cultivating with compost, we've got cultivating with straw. But how do you get to the point where you have a monotub, right? And so Rich Gee with aquarium gardening, that was the giant leap that led that preceded monotubs. And so by growing it in this aquarium, now you had more control over the conditions. You could control the humidity better. You can control the types of nutrients you're putting in. You can control how much airflow is occurring. And plus, it produced lots of pretty pictures. I mean, the book is filled with some really amazing photography. And so this all led to the culmination. Who here's heard of the PF tech? Yeah, a few people? Okay. It's probably one of the most commonly known ways of cultivating psychedelic mushrooms. And the guy's name is Robert Billy McPherson, and he went by Psilocybin Fanaticus. That was his pseudonym. And in September of 1991, he published a grow kit that became very, very, very popular. And shortly after that, in 1996, he produced his little pamphlet and was able to sell that. And that was the real first introduction of this technique to the public. Broad access. So now we're 1996. I was alive. I remember that. That was like right before the big boom of the internet. So, I was playing games with AOL and waiting hours for my dial-up to go and just turn on. But what's interesting about the PF Tech is it's so simple. And you don't need a bunch of heavy-duty equipment to do it. If you've got a pot and you've got water and you've got a mason jar, all you need is a 2-to-1 mix of vermiculite, water, and brown rice flour. Really, you can use any type of flour, but brown rice flour works pretty well. And boom, you've got a great growth medium that can produce you a healthy amount of mushrooms. And so the internet went public April 30th in 1993. And interestingly enough, Not a whole lot happened for a few years. And then it wasn't until Yathan Bernstein, who was a 15-year-old at the time, during his summer break was bored, and he started the Shroomery. 15-year-old. Who would have known? On August 8, 1997. So 4 years after the broad birthing of the internet to the public, boom, here's your community. And it's been rocking and rolling ever since. And Mycopedia, I tried to look up when they originally went online, but it was about the same time. And they are the two largest forums that I know of that share and distribute information on cultivation. And because of the internet, the door got blown wide open. And now that the internet is out there, it's kind of hard to reel it back in. And with the internet, besides just having these forums, now you have social media that's also playing a very large role. Because Shroomery has a presence on Facebook. There's a whole bunch, there's like almost an infinite amount of groups that are now on Facebook that are sharing all of this knowledge. And so because of that, it's now gained broad accessibility to the public. Anyone and everyone can just go online and Google it and find a YouTube video or find a TikTok or go to a forum or go to their favorite social media platform and find access to this information. And so through the Shroomery and Mycotopia, this rapid sharing of information, and with a foundation of the PF tech, right, which is the self-contained unit. Now all of a sudden, it's not a very big leap to go to a monotub. Because with these jars, you're taking the jar and you end up birthing it, you take it out of the jar and you put it into a Tupperware anyway to go and provide, right, from the aquarium gardening, right? So you have this climate-controlled environment. And so the PF tech, that's essentially what you're doing, is you're taking this jar, you're putting it in a climate-controlled environment or something that you can quasi-control, and then allowing the mushrooms to do what they naturally do. And so people were taking the cakes and breaking them down into little Tupperware trays. And so it's not a really giant leap to say, well, why don't I just make the entire tub a tray and see how that works? And so that's become incredibly popular. And with Shroomery and Mycotopia, this information spread very quickly in the late 90s and early 2000s. And now it's one of the most popular methods of production that people do in their homes, because it's self-contained. It conserves most of the water in the system. If you have a good ratio of water to substrate to inoculant, you tend to get really good results. And it's a very set it and forget it type of ideology. You kind of put everything in there and you just check on it several months, a month later or whatever, depending upon what you're growing and how long it takes to grow. And then you can just go ahead and reap the rewards from that. And so that brings me to where we're currently at, the Uncle Ben's tech, right? Who's heard of the Uncle Ben's tech? Yep, okay. So what's pretty interesting about Uncle Ben's is it was a company founded, Converted Rice Inc. in 1943 first started marketing Uncle Ben's. It's now owned by Mars Inc., which owns all the candy and all the things. The trademark for Ready Rice was originally published in 1990. But without the internet, the idea of using it as a source of food for mushrooms kind of lay dormant until 2004, right? So almost 14 years later, when Mars was like, hey, we want to rebrand this thing. We need to get this out to the public. Americans they're needing food faster. Let's go and start marketing pre-made rice. And so that's when Uncle Ben's, and now at 2004, right, the early 2000s, the internet's like a whole thing. Shroomery's been around for several years, right? And so that was the beginnings of the first experimentations that I could find was in early 2005, right after the rebranding of this product. And for a lot of people it works. Some people say it doesn't work. Some people it does. I mean, it's very simple. You just cut off the corner, you inoculate it, you put some micropore tape on it, and you just wait and see what happens. And so for a lot of people who are just like, I really don't want to put a ton of money into it. I have no idea what I'm doing, and I am willing to go and put 20 bucks down and just see what happens. This is a simple go-to method. And this is, basically where we're at. So at this point, that's the end of the presentation. But I just wanted to say that it's always still evolving. And I hope that through this, you can see that this has been a part of as human nature, this has been a part of humanity for as long as we've been human. And there were many sacrifices along the way of indigenous people who bore this burden and were able to bring it to us now. And there were many scientists that researched this. And then people who read that research and were like, we got to make this easier for everybody to understand. Can't just leave it to the academics. We got to break this stuff down. And so it was a team effort. Once it became known, it all of a sudden became very much a team effort in order to bring it to the public in a way where, in any state outside of Georgia, Idaho, and California, you can have access to spores, you can have access to grow kits. And in all 50 of those states, you can go and find them just growing outside, pretty much year-round. Different species, but just year-round. And so, I'll just leave you all with the idea that this is a human experience. Has nothing to do with your race, with your ethnicity, though there are certain people that had access to it and knowledge of it well before others. And that in my belief, is that in how these mushrooms are going to save us from ourselves, is that because it's a human experience, there's nothing stopping anyone who takes it from being able to have that mystical experience. And it takes an entire village. And that's why we bring Emory in here, and that's why we wanted to bring the CDC in here, is that it takes an entire village of people to see the bigger picture, to go and not ask for permission to do what's right, like George H. Grant did with Emory. He didn't ask to go and start his center. He just did it. And that's really what it takes. And I appreciate all of you coming here today, because you got to be brave to be a weird mushroom person and to show up and keep coming to these events. And I appreciate all of you so deeply. Thank you so much. And if there's any questions, I'm here to answer them to the best of my knowledge. You can even ask a personal question if you want to. I don't think I'm as funny as Trad, but Yep. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, in the past several years in particular, have I noticed there being an explosion in growing exotic species like ovoids, and I'm blanking on what the avalanche mushroom is that's in Central and South America, yeah, and all of this other stuff. And yeah, I actually have, and so I think that's a multi-layered question, from the fact that I think that, because I first cultivated my own mushrooms back in 2009, 2010, and had myself a mystical experience, and that's where I found my reverence and deep appreciation for it. And when I quit my job at CDC, and around 2018, I'd already established my business, Mushroom Kings, and was in the mushroom space. So I've been riding this wave for over a decade. And in the past several years, I have not seen the push for the movement, not just for psychedelics, but just overall mushrooms being the solution to these problems, that I have ever since COVID. And I think what happened is that Americans love to cope. We love to cope with food. We love to cope with festivals, with going out, seeing things, drinking, right? We love to cope with our friends. And when COVID happened, we got none of that. All of that shut down. Everything shut down. And it forced people to sit with themselves, and they were unhappy. a lot of people were really unhappy. And first they turned to alcohol and other substances. And then when they spiraled in depression, they then went to Big Pharma. And they were like, hey, you know, do you got a pill for that? And Big Pharma was like, yeah, I've got plenty of them. And after being on those pills for a couple of years, and this is just my personal experience from the people that I've been watching and seeing. You know, this may not be everybody's experience, but this is what I've seen. And after that whole thing happened, people were like, well, you know, the booze didn't work, the pills aren't working, there's got to be something. I still feel empty inside. And that's where people started researching what else could work. And people are starting to turn to nature, just like trad. And so that's where I believe this whole boom has come from. And then with the interest comes a fascination for the what ifs. Like, what if there's more than just a cubensis or a whatever? And that's where you've got people like Alan Rockefeller who've been for decades, you know, researching and going out to rare and unique places and finding these psilocybin-containing species. And I think that's a part of it. It's like where there's been the drive for the interest in the healing, now people are interested in learning about all these other different things that can do the thing, you know? And as his popularity grows, so is the popularity of all these other species that are coming about. So that's kind of like the long form of, does that answer your question? Okay, okay. Anything else? Yeah. But yeah, I mean, the stoned ape theory. Yeah, I mean, who's to say it's not true? Right? I mean, at some point, we started eating meat. We stopped just gathering. We started eating meat. If you're going to eat meat, you're going to be following something that produces it. If you're following the thing that produces it, you're probably seeing their poop everywhere. And just like in the cave paintings from Spain almost 7,000 years ago, you know, you could argue they weren't mushrooms. I mean, I think they look like mushrooms. It kind of just makes sense. So as soon as you go from being a gatherer to a hunter, all of a sudden now you're exposed to things that you wouldn't normally be looking for. You're not necessarily gonna, you may find these species growing out of wood chips or growing off of a tree, but you may not have the inclination to be like, yeah, I wanna eat that. But when you're following these animals and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, there's a ton of this thing growing after a heavy rain, maybe I'll give it a shot, you know? So I think that inevitably, life and intelligence is self-organizing. And that with enough energy put into a system, it creates its own level of organization. And so the more energy you are able to amass, either through an idea or through a culture, right? Or through a people's, you know, 2 people is a pair, is a couple. 1,000 people is now a small city. It's a town. You know, 10,000 people, now you've got a small city, right? Millions of people, now you have a state. Hundreds of millions of people, now you have a country, right? And so it's all building upon itself. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think that given enough time and given enough exposure, with enough energy put into the system, it's eventually going to self-organize itself into a way that is of a higher intelligence, because it has to. You can't take all that energy and not organize it. Otherwise, you lose it. So, hope that answers your question. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Thank you so much again for coming to the Atlanta Mushroom Festival. This concludes the event. Y'all are awesome. I love all of you. And I see a bunch of familiar faces. Thank you all for coming out.